So with that said, I'm seeing now 2 minutes past 1 o'clock. So I'll take down this holding slide and just want to give a big welcome to everybody again for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to come into this webinar and to join it, but we really hope that you'll also participate as we go. My name is Eileen Burbidge. I'm the Executive Director at Fertifa. We are the most comprehensive reproductive health benefits provider in Europe, and it is such a pleasure. This is like our sort of real celeb webinar here to have Joe Hardwood with us today as well. And before I have Joe introduce themselves, I'm actually going to put up a poll so that that can help maybe steer some of the things that we emphasize, both in your introduction, Joe, but also in some of the topics we're going to talk about, because I just want to ask people to sort of set the scene and have them let us know whether or not the organization that they're at now already has some form of fertility and family forming support in place at their organization. And so then, like I said, based on the answers, because if 100% say they do or 100% say they don't, Joe, I'd love for you to sort of tie that into your intro and why it is that we're so pleased you're with us for the webinar, but maybe what you're hoping to get out of it, if that's okay.
Sure, sure. So my name is Joseph Harwood. I'm known as a makeup artist, but really I am an artist. I have been gender non-conforming since I was a kid. I didn't have testosterone naturally, so my body was more feminine when I was going through puberty, and I lived pretty much every single day from 14 in a feminine guise until a few years ago. I started to play with an androgynous look where I do a masculine look, but really I lived my life for 20 years feminine. And within my work, I've been doing so many different things within social media. I was one of the first trans people to ever brand themselves on social media. And in 2013 and 14, I entered and won a competition that Simon Cowell created called the U Generation Competition, which was basically America's Got Talent online. It was participating over a year of different challenges and things in an online format. And I became the first ever trans person to win a reality talent show. And since then, I kind of think that the industry that I work in, specifically in beauty, there were so many hurdles that I didn't think was going to be there when I started. There was very much a bias when people perceived you as trans. They didn't think that you had the same value. I was not paid the same as other counterparts in the same field as me. And I decided that I'm going to change the game. So I retrained. I went back to university and developed a biochemistry master's. And learning about biochemistry and learning about my own biochemistry led me to think about fertility. And I think that for me, when I was in my serious relationship, looking into fertility options as a trans person, it was like a minefield because every time I found an answer, there was two more questions, and it was very much important for me to cover this base. To work with a brand like Fertifa was incredible because there's rarely people like me that get the chance to actually speak and say like this went wrong or this didn't go right, and to think about how we can improve things. So I will just do my best. I'll speak from my own experience, but hopefully you guys will like it.
I think everyone's going to love it. I'm already loving it. So thank you so much
Oh,
for being with us. I think you were incredibly modest talking about, everything that you've done from the reality TV show to retraining. Did I read that you actually went through your GCSEs by the time you were how old? What
I
was
did
it?
them when I was I started
10?
when I was 9. I
Unbelievable.
went, yeah, I did everything quite early. I was kind of a Mensa kid, but it was strange because I think like when you are sort of isolated from the rest of the year group, you kind of form your own bubble, which you obviously people can see I live in a sort of like world of my own. And I think sometimes you sort of concentrate your ideas in that way. So I was always kind of like separatist in some ways, but yeah, I was always very academic.
Amazing. We're so, so glad and so feel so lucky to have you with us. So really appreciate your time. And again, that of everyone who's joined the webinar and those that might watch it back after it's been recorded. So on that point, I should have probably said this even before the poll and before your intro, just a couple of housekeeping points, if that's all right. So we are using Zoom webinar. That does mean that all the attendees to one another are anonymous. So nobody else as an attendee can see other attendees' names. However, like I mentioned, we are recording this, so do be mindful of when you use the chat function, and when you pose questions in the Q&A box, which we are going to invite you to do probably 20 times as we go through our conversation, because we'd like to hear from you and really engage with everybody else, so that it's not just a one-to-one conversation between Joe and myself, but know that you'll have the option to choose in the Q&A of being anonymous when asking your question, or having your name being identifiable there. So we are wanting to have as much engagement as possible. We don't mind if you decide to do that on an anonymous basis or not, or identifying your name, but we do want you to remember that it's being recorded. And so it's not just about people who are in the webinar right now, today, but also people who might watch it in future. So with those points made, I have set the webinar chat function to be so that everyone can chat with everyone else as well. So it's not just that you can only chat with Joe and myself. And then, of course, there is the Q&A function if you want to ask questions, which hopefully Joe and I will take as we go. So unless there's anything else that you wanted to say before we kicked off, Joe, I would just then recap what the poll results were, because I thought they were actually really interesting. So 39% of people who responded said that they did already have in their workplace fertility and family forming policies in place. 33% though, so a third of the people, said that they didn't. And then 28%, almost another third, actually said that they didn't know, which of course is probably, practically speaking, the same effect as not having one, because if people aren't aware that it exists, it's probably not serving much use. So I thought that was a really interesting split, which is basically almost a third, a third, a third. I think it does show that there is so much more to be done in workplaces, and also with education and simply awareness about why having a fertility or family forming policy in place would be valuable. Now, for the third of the attendee, actually it's more than a third, sorry, 39% of attendees and participants here who said that their workplace does already have a policy, I do hope you'll chip in as we go, because the purpose of this is to talk about alternative paths to parenthood, what it looks like for LGBTQ plus individuals, how to implement support that's fully inclusive and really accessible to all LGBTQ plus people. And so while Joe will have their experiences, I'll have my experiences, and also lessons learned from some of our Fertifa clients. We're really hoping, especially the 39% of you who also have policies in place at your workplace, that you'll chip in, either with your lessons learned, the insights that you've gleaned, or the other points that you'd want to make to others who are still thinking about it. So we'll talk about these alternative paths to parenthood, what it can look like, and what support means that's fully inclusive and accessible. I think the first thing I might want to sort of dive into is why it's so important to remove barriers and really make the healthcare accessible to everyone, literally everyone, and how that can reflect companies' commitments to diversity and inclusion. And on this point, again, Joe, you were really modest about your intro, but you have helped so many organizations, large corporates, with their DE&I initiatives. Can you, do you have maybe specific examples, or can you just talk about why you think these types of policies really come part and parcel with DE&I commitments?
Sure. Going back to my work in the beauty industry, I noticed that there was very few celebrated leadership roles of people that were trans or gender non-conforming, but there were many makeup artists that I grew up looking up to that were actually doing the campaigns. And I didn't understand why there was an imbalance of representation. And I realized that when I worked in the beauty industry, it broke down to not seeing people that were gender diverse make decisions. And when there's no one that looks like you, and this isn't just the intersection of gender or gender identity, when people don't have any representation in those decision-making meetings, you won't see changes in the face of what the business is. And this is going across the board. I've been fortunate enough to work with L'Oreal. I developed a product line with a lady called Jacka Black, and it was all designed around actually makeup techniques that would help the trans community combat gender dysphoria. And when I worked with L'Oreal, they were beginning to add some sort of behind the scenes support when people were going through transition, but they were still kind of like not representing people who were trans, who had earned their spot as a leader in those positions. And it's almost like an equity thing as well, because if you are giving the work and you're doing the work, you should also be paid the same. So it was, I had like lots of motivational reasons for working in this industry because, or in this particular sort of segment of different industries, because I wanted to see change. I wanted to see that, why were we looking at the generic white girl in every beauty campaign and we don't see lines, we see Photoshop mascara. And it was just, I wanted to make things look more realistic to the people that were creative, that were doing the actual visionary stuff. And from doing that, I worked with Estee Lauder. I then worked with Puig, and I really combated a lot of the complexities behind the scenes with the beauty industry, which was amazing. And I think once I got into that, and people realised that I was just an example of someone that went there and did it, I got the opportunity to work with various other brands, tech companies, from AI companies to Dell, and I've been fortunate enough to keep on going. But I think my main motivation, I think, is just, if no one represents someone like me, then I'm going to be that representation. And I think for me, when I was in my long-term relationship and looking at fertility options, there's so many things that are tied up with fertility when it comes to preserving your ability to have a child when you're going through a medical transition, to all the different anomalies that you go through. It's just, there's such a minefield of questions, but I guess we'll dive into that in a bit.
Well, that's perfect. I think we can dive in from what you just said. And it's a great reminder to me because I should have prefaced this when we talk about fertility and family forming, which are sort of phrases I've already used. You've just helped me remember that it's not just about fertility or, trying to fertilize and trying to have a child. It starts well before that. So for someone who's going to transition, and their, stats from the from lots of different surveys that talk about somewhere anywhere between 3 to maybe just under 10% of individuals who have actually sought to preserve either their egg and sperm before they start a hormonal transition. But clearly that number is just too low, right? And so for people who have transitioned, they're already then maybe behind the curve in terms of having not planned or done anything, sufficiently to prepare for when they decide in future they might want to become parents. And so when we think about these policies, we have to be thinking about preservation as well if we want to be wholly inclusive.
Absolutely. And the thing is, within the trans community, there is a lot of people that are terribly below the average of employment. There's so much discrimination that people still face when it comes to actually earning your spot within a workplace. And if someone is going through transition and they are going through all of the mental dissonance that going through a hormonal change is, that can affect your ability to work in some regards. Like, especially if you've dealt with gender dysphoria for 20 years in private and then it's coming to the forefront, it's a psychological thing you've got to go through as well as a physical thing. So all of those aspects play into limiting your ability to pay for this stuff. And I think so many trans people don't really understand the expense of the preservation of their fertility, or once you go through transition, how stopping the hormones to actually increase your ability to be fertile and things like that. There's so many elements. I mean, there was a wonderful example recently, and I think they covered it on the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine, of a trans man that fell pregnant after going on hormones, had the top surgery, with their partner. And I think it was a wonderful kind of like a miraculous thing. That was a great piece to look at, but that's rare. It's not as easy as that when you've gone through a hormonal change to be fertile. All of that stuff reduces drastically.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think it was a Stonewall survey that we reference on Fertifa's website and in some of our materials, that more than a third of respondents to their survey had experienced barriers or challenges to starting a family. 20% of them said the greatest barrier was the cost.
Yeah.
So it's like you've mentioned, just having the financial means to be able to either pursue preservation, or even if they have done the preservation, to maybe pursue that sort of subsequent fertility treatment, whether that's going to be IVF or IUI or ICSI or surrogacy, for example. So, when you think then about what companies can do to support individuals with their policies, what would be sort of most important in your mind, other than, as you've already said, representation seems
Mm.
huge. I mean, that's the first step, is what I'm taking away from you. Inclusion, and to also think about what the challenges are for maybe financial access as well, right? Are there other points that you'd make as well?
Well, if you can see it, you can beat it. I think is the best thing. But I think examples of people that can actually work with, if you are trans, it's you need to speak to someone that's gone through the same experience as you, really, to feel it, because there is also a fear. And I'm not medically phobic, but some of my family are, and sometimes it's like there is that hurdle to overcome, because people, it's so there's such a lack of information about transition. There's such a lack of research into what causes gender dysphoria. There is such a lack of, people don't even have proper hormone tests before they go through hormonal therapy to transition in this country. It's very difficult to actually get through that barrier, unless you pay for things privately, which is excessively expensive. And you have to have someone that's been through it, that's gone through the hurdles, the challenges, to say, well, what happens if this goes wrong? What does it look like when it doesn't work out? Because once you see someone overcome that, you can see it's not going to defeat you. So I think that just having examples and a sort of a voice that represents you is so integral. But also when it comes to the representation of families that are LGBT, who are gender non-conforming or trans, we've seen some great examples in the last, I would say, 10 years of trans people be in the media with families. We never saw this before. And it's a brilliant positive example to people to say, like, look, this is who I am, this is how I am in my life, but I still want to have a family. I still want to have my baby. I want to continue my lineage or whatever. And those examples and profiling those examples are wonderful. And I think it's such a, like, we live in such an incredible time. I've spoken to elder trans people that have been through various procedures that weren't as technically developed as they are today. And there's horror stories that I've been told from, bizarrely, actually, I'll give you a strange anecdote. But my friend, who's called the Glamorous Monique, who's in her later years, shall we say, she'll kill me if I tell you her age. But she was telling me about all of the trans women that transitioned in the early 70s in America, in California. And they used to go to the house that Mrs. Doubtfire was filmed in, and that was the surgeon's house who did all the trans girls.
Oh,
Anyway,
right. Wow. I had no idea.
yeah, I've got all the stories, good and bad. I won't share the horror stories, because there's been so many brutal surgery experiences that I've heard about throughout the years, when people, because this surgery is not that old. It's still relatively new. Um, there we go.
And so when they were going through that and just thinking about how things have changed from
Mm.
what they were going through and what you see in the workplace now, do you feel like because now we're starting to see more examples, because people are being a bit more open about it and we're normalizing the conversation, that workplace, really needs to make sure they're covering all of the different pathways? So, for example, hopefully, are there more examples of IVF as well as surrogacy, as well as, preservation now, as well as adoption? And all of those different, how does a company, or how would you advise, say, a corporate client of yours or a company, to make sure that it covers all of these topics? Is it access to experts who will have those examples and for them?
Yes, access to experts. Also, the psychological side of things, if you are exploring a family, or if someone's in the workplace and they are going through a transition, to have the ability to find psychological assistance or mental health help. That's really important. I know a lot of policies have changed in the last 5 years to actually include some mental health support for people that are going through transition or questioning their gender, just because you don't know what you're going to have to overcome in those environments. You're not sure if someone's going to treat you with the right pronouns. I mean, I come from the old school where I didn't, the pronoun thing was introduced a little bit after I was exploring my gender identity. So I don't care what people call me. As long as you're not being aggressive with it, I can get where you're coming from, and I allow people to make mistakes. But lots of people find it to be affirming when you address them in their chosen identity, which is very important to do. I don't think that the educational piece within companies has been so successful, because there's so many people that are just doing their job because they want to get their paycheck at the end of the day. They're not interested in being educated at work. And sometimes, if you don't see the humanization of someone and you're just being told what to do, it creates actually a resistance to being more um, accepting. And I think just bringing people that are just giving human examples to the forefront is far more beneficial than teaching people you must use the LGBT, you must use your pronouns
Sure.
in every email, because there are so many people in this world. Some people just want to just get on with their life without being bothered by it, and it's important to include those people in the conversation because you can get on with them just as equally in a different method. So I think the humanization of trans experiences is the best way to do so.
No, that makes perfect sense, but it is a bit of a chicken and an egg, right? Because um, in you're right that people will just want to get on with things, and if they can't humanize what they're being told or, directed to say or words to use, it will actually backfire. But then,
Yeah,
in order for them to humanize it and relate it to a colleague, for example, because there's probably someone in their workplace that actually does reflect what it is that they're being sort of taught or they're being asked to be more open-minded about, in order for those colleagues then to feel comfortable to present themselves and to be confident about what they really want to be seen as and how they think of
mm-hmm.
themselves. You kind of want to make sure that it feels a safe enough space where there's at least some work on education started, right? So
Yeah,
that makes people feel comfortable to then say that they might identify as part of this group or this type of person that's being described. And then that helps the colleague realize, oh, actually, I never realized, Joe thinks of themselves that way. And that's what humanizes it, for example. And then that's what makes
yes,
the education work. So you kind of need all of it going at the same time, I guess, which is not
yeah.
very conclusive of me to say, but I'm trying to string that all together. Um, we've actually got somebody who's asked a question, and I'm not sure if this is the right time to take it or not, but I hope you don't mind. I'll ask it to you out loud, Joe. They've asked how you might suggest they best educate their employees about all the different paths and all the different options to parenthood. What would be the best way to do it? And you've already mentioned examples, for example, as one obvious example, but there are other ways. Is it sort of webinars? What other ways can you educate individuals, especially if they're still trying
Um,
to humanize it?
booking me to speak. um,
Obviously, yes.
yes. I think that the best way to show someone that there are different variations of normal in 2024 is through examples, through people that can come in. I mean, I think that again, as you said, it's a chicken and egg thing because there is an interpersonal thing when it comes to learning. Like some people, everyone learns in different ways, and we've adapted so quickly in the media, but we've not adapted within our society to different examples of things working. We've seen everything put in a debate system. So when I remember in 2014 when I started to get asked to go on Good Morning TVs, and they were like, "We're going to put you opposite a right-wing journalist," and I'd be like, "Well, I'm not going to do that when people are eating their cornflakes and debate gender identity. That's a ridiculous thing to do. It's not going to make someone understand who I am or what I'm about. And I'm not a debater. I'm a human being. I've got a career in the beauty industry, and that's who I am. I'm not there to be a pundit. I'm there to be an example if someone needs it, but I'm not. I think it's that to see someone that is there's more similarities in someone than there are differences. We've all got to deal with parents when they're sick. We've all got to pay the phone bill. We've all got to deal with these human life realities. And sometimes I think it just becomes like we're arranged, especially in the era of social media, into groups where you only see either like-minded thinkers through these algorithms, or you see the opposition that's completely indifferent, completely different to you. You don't see the people that are indifferent to the circumstance, that are very much in the middle of it, and then probably the majority people are indifferent to things. And I think when you actually give someone as an example, or you show like different examples of um, trans people forming families that have just been like there's a wonderful couple called Owl and Fox, I think they're called, and they're always in the media talking about the fact that they've had two beautiful children, and it's like they're a brilliant example of how this world works. They're just another example of a normal family, but their experience is slightly different. So
Yeah.
I guess yeah.
No, and I think you make a really good point, which is everyone's experiences are going to be different, and everyone's got a unique pathway and a unique journey, either with a partner, without a partner, going through it themselves or otherwise, and at sort of what stage in their life. And so I guess that's one thing, and this is going to sound like an advert, but I don't mean it that way. When we work with clients at Fertifa, we feel like our team has had the benefit of experience in working with, people who have gone through so many different journeys because we work with so many different companies or workplaces and different types of stakeholders. It's not just in one sector or another. So we have seen individuals doing it on their own. We've seen them doing it as part of a couple. We've seen them doing it, thinking about their preservation as they're transitioning. We've seen them, go through adoption, go through surrogacy, go through IVF, and it's completely different in terms of, the level of both financial sort of outlay that would require, legal advice that might be required, medical testing that might be required, and just sort of where the resources would be that they could rely on. And so I guess I would say, maybe an answer to the individual who asked that question is, it's important, like you've said, Joe, to show the many different examples, but then to have access to educational resources that will have familiarity or experience with all of these different pathways and empathy to deal with something if it happens to be new to them, right? And just to
Mm.
understand that everyone's journey is brand new. Um,
Maybe I could ask a quick question about this from
yeah.
your perspective. But when I was looking into the options with my fertility with my partner, there was slight differences when you were in a civil relationship in a same-sex couple, because with gender identity and sex markers on your birth certificates or your gender IDs, that is a whole minefield of questions. And I think that within this particular segment, um, I'm intrigued. Is there anything that LGBT people experience differently when they come to you legally? Because I found it quite difficult, and I spoke to Roxy about this when we were discussing doing this at the very beginning, that there wasn't actually that much educational resources. I mean, thanks to us working together, we've put together some bits and bobs that people can actually look to. But when I was looking into it, and I took 3 years of looking into it, it was like, but what is the difference? Like, if I change my sexual marker on my passport through gender transition, would that affect my ability in this way? Or if there was two M's, like, is there specifics that are different? Because I would like to learn as much as I'm sure most of the people watching, from your perspective. Are there different hurdles?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think we need a whole webinar actually on that in terms of, the legalities and the technicalities related to these points. And part of the reason is because it is still changing. And I think we've
Right.
seen it evolve. For example, we've seen recent changes to legislation about sperm donors. And of course, that might relate to a same-sex female couple, for example. But the way we support individuals who come to us for help is we can then put them in touch with legal professionals. We will be there as part of their navigational advice. We sort of end up being there as, another pair of eyes, another sort of support system that's got their back. So that we don't just say, oh, well, go Google or go look here or give a call here. We will actually be lockstep with them in
Mhm.
uncovering the information, the resources. Maybe the next person to talk to, the expert, will make referrals to a specific legal advisor, for example, or a counselor, and we will try and make sure that they can therefore make the most informed decision they can possibly make. But you're absolutely right. Doing it on one's own time is hugely time consuming, also really draining and emotionally really difficult, right? And so I think bringing it back to sort of a workplace, certainly all of our existing clients and all the workplaces we work with would want individuals to be able to bring their best selves to work, to make their professional contributions as impactful as possible. And so they wouldn't want those individuals to then be left on their own to be researching hours and hours on end. And you said it was for 3 years, be
Yeah.
hugely distracting, it would be hugely affecting one's productivity at work. You'd probably be Googling, even in the middle of the day on a work laptop. And so to have, I think, a resource that is there with some base level education about what's currently in place in terms of legislation, but where to go to kind of research further information and to do that with the individual, I think is probably the best support that we like to provide, because we're not going to know all the answers and the answer won't be the same today as it would be
Yes.
in 15 months time, but our experience hopefully helps that navigational process be a little bit easier, and with well-being support alongside for any individual that would ask.
That makes sense. I think the legal side of things on giving that guidance is totally essential because it is such ever-changing beast.
That's the thing. That's the thing. It's constantly evolving, isn't it?
Yes.
And also, we work with organizations to try and provide input into that, right? Into policymakers and to try and influence what would be most inclusive and what's in the best interest of individuals. Bring back, we've got more people asking questions. I just want to invite as many people to ask as we go along. I've sort of given up on trying to do certain themes or topics at a time. And so I think we should just have a free flowing conversation because there's
Sure.
so much to cover. And so people, I'm really pleased are asking questions, but I hope they'll keep doing that. And if it's okay for you, I'll just keep, Joe, I'll just keep going up and teeing up more and more. Some
Good.
of them are more specific and tactical than others, but one person has asked, about leave, for example, because we would certainly advocate at Fertifa if somebody's thinking about their policies and someone's thinking about what to put in place for a policy that they would consider, offering flexible hours certainly, but also plenty of time for people to go make appointments, to go attend appointments, whether they're in clinics, whether they're for legal advisors or for other professionals. And so I don't know if it'll be based on your personal experience or just those of friends or other colleagues or just different examples you've seen. Do you have any kind of a guideline or anything about what you would suggest companies offer their employees to make sure that the policy is as inclusive as possible for family forming leave?
Sure. I think there is two sides to this. There's the success story, and then there is the story of someone that's accepting that they're infertile, which is a whole other uh route path take. It's difficult, and there was a very beautiful, there's that fabulous show on Netflix called Heartstopper, and there's a young trans girl who did a TikTok, and they developed a filter that made you look as if you were growing a baby, and because she was trans, she had to come to terms with the fact that she couldn't carry her own child. And it did, to accept that in yourself when you've dealt with gender dysphoria and you've gone through a transition and you're socially acclimatized to being female, but you still haven't got the ability to have a child. And I'm sure there are many cisgendered women that are also experiencing that when they find out they're infertile. It's that mental health support that's also, that I think is important, because you have to gain radical acceptance in that, because you can't change certain aspects. It's one of the things that you just have to, like, I used to deal with this all the time. I used to think it was terrible because, like, when I was living everyday feminine, I would be like, oh my god, I'd love to have my own baby, I'd love to have my own baby in that way. But then you I went through therapy, and I think therapy was very much a integral part of accepting me. And then I started to explore my gender and blah 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 blah. But it's that part needs to be included within the scape you give someone that's experiencing that, because expecting someone to come to terms with that on their own and not giving them space to work that out, it's kind of not going to be productive, is it? So there's that aspect, but also when you're going through a situation where someone is forming a family through these fertility routes, is just allowing them to be able to be private with that or open with that. It's giving someone the option to discuss whatever they feel comfortable with, not making it into this routine thing, but being flexible within their own experience and just adapting to what they're actually going through. I guess that's, from my perspective, that's the most helpful things I can think of.
No, I think that's right on point. And maybe tying that to a leave policy. I mean, I think what I've heard you say is flexibility is the most important thing.
Yeah,
And also to be able to listen to the employee about how their journey is going or what route it's going to take. Because like you said, it completely depends on whether or not somebody is quote unquote successfully going through a journey versus unsuccessful versus having to deal with the consequences of some sort of finding or test result. And so therefore listening to what the employee is going through and working with them in terms of what they'll need for leave is probably the best way to go about it. And I'm sure companies will have annual leave that they can already pull from, sick leave. Maybe there's already parental leave or family leave, bereavement leave, for example. Some companies will have pregnancy loss leave already. And so thinking about the best way to construct something for everyone's individual case is probably the right thing. And like you said, it is not just about the medical treatments, or I've mentioned the legal professionals, it's also the mental health, right? And you might
great.
just need leave for mental health. So thank you for that.
There's
Another,
also the people
yeah,
that identify as non-binary, which is difficult when you have paternal and maternal leave, because they don't identify with either of those things. So you have to let them give it to you as opposed to
of course.
give it to them.
Yeah, you don't want to mandate something or impose a label on something, do you, in terms of the leave, of what the leave is
Yes.
for? And actually, the more we're seeing with clients that we work with, it's less maternity or paternity leave, and it's about carer leave, or it could simply be well-being leave, which I
Yeah.
think is a nice option. So another more specific question from somebody is whether or not um, we would suggest considering adoption policies and adoption leave as part of this type of package or this type of category for leave an area. Personally, I would say yes, but I don't know if you have a different opinion, Joe.
I agree. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
so. It's because there are different elements to family forming that it's depending on the age of a child with adoption and things. It's still the same experience, isn't it? You're changing
100%.
life at home, and it should be given the same respect and time.
I agree. I agree. And that's one of the reasons that at Fertifa we talk about it. It's not just fertility, but it's fertility and family forming. So many different ways to form a family these days. And the definition of family is so broad now, and there's many different ways about parenting and about, what a family unit looks like. So yes, we would definitely include adoption in with this. Another tactical point, and again, you brought it up so early on, so I'm grateful for that. But what level of financial support then do you think would you advise companies? My guess is it probably depends on the size of the company, the stage of it, and maybe also what sector it's in. But do you have any advice in terms of what levels of financial support companies or HR professionals should consider if they're going to be offering it as an employer?
I think that it depends on what your capacity as a company is. If you're a small company, it's very difficult to do the same thing that a huge corporate brand can do. And I think it's got to be proportionate to what you already offer to the basis. Like if we're including trans people into this discussion of family forming, and you've already got a policy in place that is for a cisgender couple that's having a baby, it should match it. I think that's the best way to start, because I can't predict what you've got to give, and I can't predict what you feel is comfortable within a company for um your situation. It completely is depending on the company, but if you've already got an in place policy for a cisgendered situation, then it should be the same with a trans person.
I love that because, as you mentioned earlier in the top of the webinar, it's about equity, isn't it? We want to be equitable and also to encourage inclusivity sort of across all sectors. So it's not about any disproportionate allocation for anybody. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mm.
And so then I wanted to also think about when you mentioned, for example, the mental health aspects and the well-being. And again, I don't mean to dig in to your personal experience if it's not
Sure.
relevant, but maybe others that you've heard. What do you think would have been most helpful to you in terms of mental health support or well-being, just general well-being support, when you were going through your discovery, your learning process, or just trying to navigate things?
So I come from quite a conservative background. My mum's family were kind of charity people, and we didn't really discuss mental health in an open way. And I think I grew up not really. I was always the person. I'm unfiltered, as probably many people can see on this discussion. But I didn't have the words to use to explain what I was feeling. And I think that sometimes when you don't know what to do, you live in this sort of a stagnant state where you don't know how to process things, you don't know how to articulate things, and it's going to lead to an unproductive person. Once I discovered, I actually went through a traumatizing experience, which I won't go into, but I was recommended to speak to a counselor about it. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not going to speak to a counselor. I will speak to my friend or whatever. But I went to a fabulous counselor, and to have someone objectively see me that wasn't tied to me, didn't have a personal relationship with me, and see things from a bird's eye perspective and feed it back to me changed how I saw things. And I was like, well, that happens and that wasn't right. And this, I feel like that, and that's not right. Or it just allows you space to realize everything. And I think that some people just don't, they have the same experience as me. They come from a family that they don't talk about mental well-being. And people need to. It's a tool. And I think anything to make someone more productive within a company is a benefit. And to offer that to everyone, there are people that are not trans that have never gone to therapy or never spoke to a counselor. And it's like, you don't need to commit to it for 20 years, but you can have like 6 sessions that is offered as part of a policy, maybe someone that's going through a strenuous time. I mean, coming out of COVID, I can imagine that I know that many mental health organizations have recorded that there has been a tremendous leap in people that are suffering in silence with various stresses. And I think that specifically around when it comes to your transition and your realization about fertility, it requires being objective. It requires someone that's not personally invested, because you're going through a hormonal change that's not dissimilar to the menopause. And it's like, when you're going through that medical transition, how can you see how you're changing when you're experiencing the change? You have to have someone. So it's I think it should be an essential offer to support people, particularly trans. But if you are not, if in any circumstance, I think everyone should have the access to do. I think it should be introduced as a mandatory thing within all companies, particularly because COVID and the lockdown had such a shocking effect on so many people's lives, and we're seeing the aftermath of it at the moment, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, and you've kind of said two words that I wrote down, but it's access to, isn't it? And I love that you think it should be mandatory to have access to. I couldn't agree more. But people, really benefit from having someone to speak to who maybe isn't emotionally invested in the journey, but can give them that bird's eye view, as you mentioned. So yeah, it is the access that's really, really key. And then thinking about that, back to something else you said earlier about examples, and then just the offer of somebody to help as well. I wonder if in the partnerships that you had with corporates, if you saw a lot of success and engagement from, say, LGBTQ networks or employee networks and employee groups that those companies might have had. Is that something that you'd recommend then companies sort of initiating if they haven't already, and how to go about doing that?
Absolutely. I mean, I did an ERG with Estee Lauder, which was fantastic. A lot of their LGBT and well, a lot of actually their brand directors were LGBT, and it was amazing that they didn't have a sort of intern network where they could discuss with each other like specific issues that were relating to being gay or lesbian or non-binary or whatnot. And I think when I worked with Dell, they had a fantastic interworking network that was sort of like an LGBT resource where you could access not just information about what to experience if you are starting your transition, or if you've just come out as a gay person, where are there things that you can do? Or it's not the rainbow washing that we see with corporate stuff over pride, which I find to be quite silly sometimes, because I think like when you're parading around pride events with these huge logos, but you actually don't pay the LGBT people that you're employing to be decorative, the same as the people that are running the show. It doesn't make any sense. It's got to be something that's got tangible change. And if you have access to people like you, and you all go through the same sort of experience, whether it's discrimination or it's just someone's got a funny opinion about it, whatever the situation, the level of it is, seeing someone that's like you and speaking to them about it in the same situation will allow you to work out a strategy to combat it in future. And I think it's also it can be sometimes like a safety net when you have an interworking network of LGBT people, because you it's hard sometimes for people to understand all the complexities, like in every intersection, whether you're black from a white person's perspective, or if you're gay from a straight person's perspective. To have someone that's like you, that understands your inner workings more intimately, is beneficial, I think. So definitely, they're so useful.
Yeah, employee networks, brilliant. I love that. And also, of course, not just an LGBT network, but there could also be networks then specifically related to family forming or
Yes.
potentially preservation, or actually navigating sort of legal topics like these, as another example. Um, I had promised you, Joe, nobody else would have heard this because it was before we sort of opened it up to everyone else, that I usually try to keep these to about 45 minutes because I know how precious, you've alluded to post-COVID world as well, if getting a few minutes back before people's next call or the next top of the hour is. So I'm probably going to look to wrap up now. But I didn't know if there was anything else that you were hoping we'd get a chance to talk to. You were waiting for a question to come in, maybe from another participant, or anything else that you wanted to emphasize. Otherwise, I'm counting them, and I usually try to keep things to like 3 or 4 key points, but I'm already up to 6. So I don't know if you had anything else you want to add before I kind of go through my recap.
I think the thing that I think I like people to take away from understanding about trans people is there is so much about this ephemeral idea of gender identity. It's something that we think in our minds, but there is actually a chemical imbalance component that is never brought up in these discussions, which I think is really integral to talk about. I won't go into it in great detail, but there are so many people within this culture in this time that are born chemically intersex, which means that they don't have the neutral levels that we would assume that a cisgender man or woman would be. That can form in so many different things. And there's also things that contribute to this, like polycystic ovary syndrome. There are lots of different fertility related ailments that are going on rampantly at the moment, whether it's from our food, whether it's just genetic, whatever's going on. There's a lot more than we've documented before. And to understand some of that is like going into a whole encyclopedia of information that you have to really commit to learning, and it's very complex for people. So instead of focusing on, I think, the chemical and the aspect side of it that I look at and I'm interested in, it's always about the human side of things, because we all have to go through different experiences, we all have to go through different individual problems, and it's when you see someone that's relatable and you see someone that's gone through it and has actual lived experience of the situation, I think it hits home a lot more. And I think that that's just the thing that I would end it on. It's just everyone is complex and individual, and I think that it's so important that we see those individuals speak. So I want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this, because people think I'm just a silly makeup artist, but it's something that's so passionate for me. And I to be respected by you is amazing, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to be
Oh my
here.
gosh. I mean, we're the ones that are so honored. So thank you for that. And I love that. That's where you've ended on sort of, everyone's got their own, everyone's human, and everyone has their human challenges, their human journeys. I think that is where I would end things. I'd just pick out a few of the other things that we talked about. And it's actually come full circle, because the first thing you helped me realize is, even though we titled this webinar about fertility and family forming policies, that leads people to probably too narrowly think about things like IVF, about adoption, about surrogacy. And it includes so many different topics, including preservation, for example, egg freezing, sperm freezing, and anything that people might go through before they start hormonal transition. And then your point that a lot of trans individuals will be starting from hormonal differences or imbalances as compared to cisgendered individuals as well. So we have to bear that all in mind. And just talking about fertility and family forming, it's a much bigger topic. The second point, therefore, is that policies, if we're talking about that for workplaces, do just need to be flexible. They need to be flexible, they need to be equitable, they should be in proportion not only to the business, the size, the stage, but also to the other existing policies that are in place for cis individuals. And then there need to be relatable to human examples, would be the third point. And like you said, you can't do or achieve what you can't see. Part of maybe making human examples or bringing them to life are employee networks, and the opportunity to try and actually bring experts to the fore, or to work with organizations, whether it's for TIFA or somebody else that's in the sector. Finally, two more points, but one is that can't overlook the financial situation and the financial kind of assets that are required, or the support that can be lent. And then in addition to the financial support, there is mental health well-being as well that just needs to encompass all of this. And then I am going to come back full circle, and just to remind people that while we think about trans individuals as a community, as a collective group of individuals, as a part of the employee population, everybody is an individual. Everyone's human at the end of the day, whether they're cis, trans, even non-binary, anything that we haven't even talked about in this topic or in this webinar, and that everybody should be treated with individual respect. And any policy should just set up the guardrails to encourage that kind of conversation between an HR or people team and the individual. So that's a really rambling sort of wrap up, but there were so many points that came out that I absolutely loved, and any one of them could have been our headline and our sort of concluding point. But thank you so much. You'll see from all the emoji reactions and all the comments that are in the chat that everyone's so chuffed to have seen you join us for the webinar. We are chuffed. Like I said, it's really kind of our celeb webinar here to have you with us.
Oh.
I've also made a point of posting in the chat where there could be more resources if people want to follow up. We'll obviously have recorded this and we'll share the recording with people too. But thank you so, so much for joining us, Joe. And I can't wait to actually see, for those who might have seen, this is actually the first of a two-part webinar series that we're doing with you. And so if today is anything to show for it, next week's going to be even better and it's going to be even more exciting. And I really can't wait. You'll have a conversation with Celine. And I just can't thank you enough for lending your time for both of these conversations, for being so open, for being so authentic, and relaying your personal experiences as well as everything that you've gleaned from all of your professional experiences in working with companies on these topics. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We'll speak with you soon. Take care. And thanks everybody for joining. Bye-bye.